Hey branches, we are continuing in our series, Begin Again. And it's these 6 weeks that lead us to Good Friday, to Easter Sunday, the season of Lent. A chance for us to experience a time of confession and renewal, experiencing God's grace in the deepest parts of our lives. When we were together for First Sunday a little bit ago, it was awesome when we started off looking at Psalm 51, verses 1 through 4. And right now I want to unpack for us Psalm 51, 5 through 9. So just these next few verses. And we're going to see through these verses that beginning again with God is an inside job. It's an inside job, but it's an inside job that begins on the outside. It begins with God. Beginning again with God is an inside job that brings truth. And that's one of the first things we're going to see is this call to honesty. This invitation to face the reality of the truth of ourselves and the truth about God. Albert Einstein has an interesting quote about reality. He says that reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. Right? So many of us, sometimes we want to think reality is not real, but it just keeps hitting us in the face, right? It doesn't seem to go away because it's the truth. One of my pastor friends, Bob Reed, says, reality is your friend. Reality is your friend. Reality tells us the truth about where we're at, our situation. And sometimes the truth is hard to hear. For David, who wrote this Psalm 51, the truth about what he had done was hard to hear for him. He didn't want to hear it at all. He wanted to, in fact, ignore it. You know, the fact that he had stolen another man's wife, got her pregnant, and then tried to cover it up, and when that didn't work, put the husband out in the battlefield in a precarious situation so he would be killed on purpose, but it would look like an accident, and he was trying to cover his tracks, and he thought he maybe was in the clear, and then he was presented with the truth through a trusted friend, an advisor, one of the king's advisors, this prophet named Nathan, a truth teller who was part of the king's inner circle. And Nathan had to share a parable to get David to face the truth. He had to tell him a story that seemed unrelated but was actually related. And all of a sudden it just comes clear to David, this is a parable. This is a story about what he'd done as the rich king stealing this poor man's wife and all the destruction and selfishness and hurt that he had caused. And when he realized that, he was cut to the quick, and he wrote this Psalm 51, this poem of confession and renewal as he turns towards God. This inside job that God does in us, it brings about truth. It brings about the honesty of who we are, the truth of ourselves, and the truth about God. Because denying the depths of our sin is really self-deception. Only when we see the depths to which we've fallen can we see the heights to where God wants to lead us. That's why it's called amazing grace, because of what God can do. Our first verse in Psalm 51 that we're looking at today, verse 5, David takes it way back, this truth, this honesty, way back to the very beginning. And he says, "For I was born a sinner. Yes, from the moment my mother conceived me. But you desire honesty from the womb, teaching me wisdom even there." From the very beginning. The Message paraphrase says, "I've been out of step with you for a long time, in the wrong since before I was born. What you're after is truth from the inside out." But this is an inside job, but it starts on the outside. And that's why at Branches we sing to God. That's why we give of our finances as stewardship to God, why we're generous to God. We want to give back. We want to pay it forward because of what God's done for us, this outside work of grace and mercy. And we want to respond. That's why we sing songs together. That's why we celebrate together, because of God's awesome grace. So this is an inside job that not only brings honesty, but it's an inside job that brings purity. The kind of purity that only God can bring about. that only His grace can do. In verse 7, David says this, "Purify me from my sins, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." This is an outside ask to God. God, would you do this? The message says, soak me in your laundry, and I'll come out clean. Scrub me, and I'll have a snow-white life. It sounds impossible. If you've ever tried to get a stain out of fabric, a deep one, maybe, one of those kind that just takes multiple processes, days, I don't know, you're trying different chemicals, all the products you're throwing at it, and it's hard to get a stain out. But this is a picture of God's incredible grace, able to reach right into the fabric of our nature, right into the fibers of our being, and purge us, to cleanse the sin. That word cleanse is translated in some translations actually as unsin, to unsin me, cleanse me, unsin me. And only God can do that through Jesus and His work of grace. I wonder if you might be thinking, maybe I'm not really that sinful. Like we talked about this last time too, we sometimes measure our status of like sin or missing the mark with God by other people, by society. And we say, our standard is that, well, on a social scale, we appear pretty good. We don't engage in antisocial behavior. Maybe we're outwardly positive. Maybe we're helpful, and we're basically polite people. But that comparison with us and others isn't what the Bible uses. The Bible's test is how we relate to God, and God, our Creator, and what He's doing in our hearts. And the question is, do we love God with all of our heart, our soul, mind, and strength? Do we love our neighbor as ourselves, like the Bible challenges us? And the answer is clear, we do not. In fact, Romans 3:23 just declares it as clear as day, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So we need this inside job that begins on the outside, that can really bring about the needed change that we need, that can bring about this purity, this soaking of, the fibers of who we are, to cleanse us, and only Jesus offers that for us. What about this idea of guilt? I mentioned the word guilt. What do you do with guilt? Some of us, you might not understand really sin yet. Maybe you don't want to look at that in an honest way yet, and you want to believe that you're not really guilty of anything, and guilt is an overrated thing. But some of us are crushed by guilt. We're open to receiving God's forgiveness, but it's hard to forgive ourselves. It's hard to forget the things that we're shamed about or embarrassed about. It's hard to move forward in God's grace. There's this quote that's been rattling around in my head these last couple of weeks, and it's by Ronald Rolheiser. He says this, that he's seen that mark in all kinds of people, that guilt that I'm talking about. He says divorcees, ex-priests, ex-religious, people who have had abortions, married people who have had affairs, people who have made serious mistakes with their children, and countless others who made serious mistakes. There is too little to help them, he says. We need a theology of brokenness. He goes on to say that we need a theology which teaches us that even though we cannot unscramble an egg, God's grace lets us live happily and with renewed innocence far beyond any egg we may have scrambled. We need a theology that teaches us that God does not give us one chance, but that every time we close a door, He opens another one for us. There's a song I wrote years ago called "The Sound Forgiveness Makes." It's about that restoration, that clean slate that comes from when we receive God's forgiveness and when we, in turn, give that out to others as a forgiving person. The freedom that comes in that is described in this song. And so there's a link to it below. I just encourage you, check it out, take a listen, and see if God might say something to you through it. Well, our last two verses in this passage, verses 8 and 9, say this: "Give me back my joy again, You have broken me. Now let me rejoice. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. God can restore our lives, bringing even joy back to us. You know, just like I had mentioned, some of us, that feeling of guilt kind of dragging around behind us. David wants to declare and for us to be encouraged that can be replaced with actual joy. Joy in experiencing the grace of God. Beginning again with God is an inside job that brings honesty to our lives. It brings purity that only God can give, and it brings restoration. It can restore joy to our lives. And this is brought about by Jesus, his coming, his death, his resurrection. Lent is a time to reflect on this truth together, to recognize our dependence on God and his saving work through Jesus. What if every one of us could take this journey together in faith? Could you imagine, what if we could ask God to do this inner work in us together, earnestly, sincerely? What if we could say, God, would you show us the truth of ourselves? We're ready to face it. Or what if we could say, God, would you make us pure and right with you and receive that work that Jesus can do of restoration, of purity in our life? And then we could say, God, restore my joy and my hope. Those are prayers that David invites us to pray together as we begin again with God. At Branches, we want to be a community just like that. And we want to be a community that's grounded in truth, in reality. That's not afraid to look at the truth of who we are and the truth about who God is. And we want to be a people that looks to God for things to be made right, who trusts God for that act of forgiveness, that act of purifying our lives, making us right with God. And we want to be a family that is full of joy and hope because of Jesus, who enters into that restoration journey with God in gratefulness, in joy because of who God is and what he can do. I want to close these moments with a few questions for you to ponder. And they're written down below, but here they are now. And maybe you might even want to close your eyes as you're listening, or if you're driving, or don't do that. But, listen if you would as you open your heart to these questions in prayer. Would you pray with me that you might want to ask this in these moments with God? When in your life did someone point out a truth about you that was hard to hear? Maybe kind of go back a little bit in your life. What was that like to be kind of called out? Hopefully it was in love, like the person cared about you. And how did you respond? What do you think about the phrase, reality is your friend? How might it be a friend to you in new ways? Maybe how has it not been a friend, or how have you been tempted to ignore reality or pretend it isn't real? And what would it be to embrace reality for you right now? What about this one? What's the worst stain you've ever gotten, on your clothes or carpet, or an actual stain? And how did you get it out? Did it work? Was it successful? Imagine getting a stain out of material and the challenge that is. And how do you imagine God's grace cleansing you completely? And I wonder, what part do you need to play in this? How do you want to respond to God as he offers this gift of purity and restoration to you? And lastly, where does your joy and hope come from? How might you practice receiving joy from God instead of other things, especially during this season of Lent? What are some things that you can do to help focus your attention on God, the real source of reality, the source of purity, and the source of restoration? Let's continue in this season together as we look towards Good Friday, as we look towards the gift that Jesus gives us through his life, his death, his sacrifice, and his resurrection as we begin again with God.